As I mentioned in my introductory lecture, the so-called geometric period is the first artistic period as Greece is emerging from the Dark Ages. The polis or city-state is beginning to form. It's not hard to see how the period gets its name. What seems to be the most dominant geometric figure in this section of the Diplaian crater? The bodies are composed largely of triangles, but we also see those odd circles within circles. Just what this signifies remains a bit of a mystery. It's hard to see this from the slide, of course, but that funeral vessel stood more than 3 feet high. Its bottom was open so that libations or sacred liquid offerings could be poured into it directly over the grave. Let me note, by the way, that this is an important work, and it's one that does show up on the AP test, or has shown up on past AP tests, which means it will show up on your unit test. You'll notice a couple of vocabulary words here. A crater is a vessel for mixing wine and water. It's usually wider at the top and has handles placed high on the vessel. A meander is the pattern, the key pattern around the top, and you'll continue to see this in Greek vases even after the geometric period. Let me note, by the way, I'm going to be talking more about vase painting when I get to the painting unit, but we're dealing with orientalizing and geometric here so that we can move into sculpture. So what's happening in that upper panel, which is blown up here for you to see? Well, you see a corpse lying on a bier. How is this person portrayed? Very strangely, in profile, but with a frontal eye and a completely triangular torso, a small head, and surrounded by lots of geometric figures and some highly stylized animals. One oddity, which your textbook points out, is that the artist indicates the gender of the deceased by painting a penis sticking out of his thigh. I tried to blow up that portion on the slide, but it's still a little hard to see. What's significant here is, first, that human figures have returned to Greek art after the Dark Ages, and second, that narrative or storytelling in art has also revived. Civilization is returning to the Aegean. Here's another illustration of the geometric style and another vocabulary word. An amphora is used to store wine, water, or oil. It's taller and it has handles lower on the vessel. You're going to see some other vase shapes when we get to vase painting, but those are the two terms that seem to show up most frequently on the AP exam. Art historians, let's see if this show, oh, I've got it here. Art historians use a term to describe this kind of design that was not in your textbook, but I'm including it anyway since I think it's interesting. Horror vacui, or xenophobia, means just what it sounds like, fear of empty spaces. It actually had a religious underpinning in Greek culture. To leave empty space was to invite dangerous spirits to fill the void, which was the reason why these vases were so completely decorated. I just think that's kind of interesting. So here is a sculpture from the geometric period. Again, we see a man-beast, which was a theme that appeared in a lot of the Near Eastern art. You think of the Sphinx or the lamassu. Notice that the centaur's forelegs are human, while the back legs are animal, which is a little weird. So how does this differ from Near Eastern sculpture? Well, the most important difference is that the human figure is nude, except for the helmet, which in my view rather emphasizes the nudity. How does the figure exhibit hierarchy of scale, which of course was a feature of much Near Eastern art? Well, a horse would be larger than a man, but this is a hero. It's thought it was probably Hercules or Heracles, so appropriately he's larger than his horse. We move forward a century now to what is referred to as the Orientalizing period. This, you may recall, is a time when the Greeks revived their trading contacts with the Near East, and you see a lot of influence of Near Eastern art. So, in that spirit, what Near Eastern elements do you see in this lintel from a temple? Remember what a lintel is up above the doorway? Well, you see, take a look at the headdresses, which resemble Egyptian figures. Notice, too, the profile animals with twisted perspective, and the animals themselves are really Near Eastern. The lion, of course, is an important symbol of power. But what really strikes me is how motionless and static these figures are. Now that is about to change. So what evolution in Greek art do you observe in this Orientalizing sculpture? While we see still more interest in human anatomy, I'm particularly intrigued by the hint of pectoral and abdominal muscles you see in this figure. It also is clearly designed to be viewed in the round. Just get a load of those buttocks. But what remnants do you see of the geometric style? Well, the torso is still triangular, and I would say those buttocks are a little too circular to be realistic. So what does the placement of the hands indicate about the sculpture's function? Think of the Sumerian figures. Yes, this too was a votive offering. But note that unlike the Sumerian votive offerings, which I've shown here, the hands extend out into space. This is another important innovation in Greek art. Art historians use a term, negative space, to describe basically the area or the air around a statue. Most Near Eastern sculpture makes relatively little use of negative space. In other words, the figures are self-contained. Greek sculptured figures, on the other hand, begin to reach out into the space around them, both to indicate movement and to indicate a connection with the wider world. Like so much in Greek sculpture, this has a philosophical as well as an artistic significance. So what marks this amphora as orientalizing, besides the date of around 625 BCE? Well, the animals are exotic. You see the lions, panthers, and composite creatures, such as the siren that's circled on the pot, which is part bird and part woman. But notice that we still see rather geometric body styles. I'm going to talk again, as I said, more about vase paintings in a later lecture. Oh, there's the siren, excuse me. I'm going to talk more about architecture in later lectures too, but note, and you saw this lintel before, this was part of a very simple early temple design, similar to a Mycenaean megaron with a central hearth or sacrificial pit. This is probably the earliest temple with a sculptural decoration. We'll see lots more, and again, you see that lion, an indication of the Orientalizing period. Kore is female, Kouros is male, right? You need to keep those terms straight. They show up a lot on the AP exam. We are still in the Orientalizing period, although this is really a transitional work. So how is the depiction of the human figure evolving in Greek art? Well, this Kore is more tubular than triangular. It's still a geometric shape, but it comes a little closer to actual human shape. What is her facial expression? She is smiling, a rather strange, mysterious smile, something would later be called the Mona Lisa smile. Art historians actually call this the archaic smile because it shows up so much in archaic sculpture, which you're going to be seeing in just a minute. But it's also characteristic of this earlier, really transitional period. Note that she is wearing clothes. Men are usually depicted in the nude in Greek sculpture, and women are usually clothed, at least until a much later period. The exception sometimes is goddesses, who occasionally get to run around in the buff. Note that the Lady of Auxerre's dress is so sheer that her breast shape is clearly visible. This may actually be an indication that she was meant to be a goddess. We don't know. If you know anything about Greek mythology, however, you know that the gods and goddesses tended to have very active and rather strange sex lives, hung around with animals a lot, for example. And maybe that's an explanation for the nudity exception. So how does this famous early Kouros, remember Kouros male, resemble the Egyptian statue on the left, and how do they differ? Actually, there are a lot of similarities. Both statues are funerary. The Kouros was a grave marker. They both put the left foot forward without demonstrating any shift of weight, or that is, actual movement. This means that one leg has to be sculpted longer than another. That's going to change, and it's a very important change that we'll see in the next lecture. In both sculptures, the hair is very stylized. The pose is rigidly frontal. The expression is unnaturally serene. Yet still, the Greek statue is nude, and again, it shows more exploration of musculature. So compare, for example, the kneecaps. What about a comparison with the Orientalizing Greek statue? Well, the torso of the Kouros is still triangular, but less unnaturally so. We're beginning to see something closer to a real human shape. The legs, too, have a much more muscular and realistic shape, and the neck is no longer stylized and elongated. So here's another interesting comparison. Note that both the Egyptian coffre, I hope you recognize coffre there, and the archaic calf bearer, this is one of my favorite sculptures, they both meld an animal and a person for religious purposes. So, what is the difference in how this relationship is portrayed? Well, first of all, the hawk is a symbol of the pharaoh god. The calf, by contrast, is an offering by the person. It is not a depiction of a god. So although the animal and human are combined, they're combined for very different purposes. The man is bringing an offering to a god. The Greek statue also portrays a different and really, I would say, more intimate relationship between man and animal, with man having a new ascendancy. This is the humanism of Greek sculpture. So how does this later Kouros show further development in Greek sculpture? Well, while it retains the somewhat triangular shape, again, and the stylized hair and the archaic style, this figure is moving closer to natural and is showing much more musculature. The head is better proportioned. The planes of the head are not as flat. The hips are more rounded, and of course we see more abdominal muscle. Real six-pack here. Some of the original paint remained on this statue. Encaustic, which is another vocabulary word, is pigment that's mixed with hot wax and applied to the statue while it's still hot. This helps it stick. It's actually quite tough to get paint to adhere to stone, and this was the most common technique. It's also a term that shows up frequently on the AP exam, so memorize it, okay? Again, a kore is a female. So what gives the peplos kore its name? A peplos is actually the name for her woolen, belted garment, as distinguished by the chiton underdress and himation cloak from the slightly later Acropolis statue. You don't really need to know those terms, but it's kind of interesting to see how clothing is being portrayed, and again, emphasizing that women are usually portrayed as clothed in Greek statues. What other innovation do these statues show? Well, it's a little hard to tell because it's broken off, but one arm would have extended out into space. Again, we see that use of negative space, breaking away from the very tight envelope. We're going to see more of this as we continue to move through Greek sculpture. Here again, you can see the contrast between the Orientalizing sculpture and the Archaic. Note the softer, more feminine features of the Archaic kore, the more realistic draping of the cloth. But what similarities remain? Well, the figures are still largely stationary, largely tubular, and very stylized. In the next lecture, we're going to see a new realism emerging in Greek sculpture as we enter the classical period.